The photograph arrived at the archive sealed in brittle wax paper, its edges curled like something trying to shy away from the present. An 1890s Christmas portrait, 8 figures arranged in rigid Victorian symmetry. The father seated in the center, children dutifully arrayed around him, and behind them all, a man dressed as Santa Claus, hands resting heavily on the patriarch's shoulders. At first glance, it appeared harmless, even sentimental. But the more time you spent with it, the more wrong the image felt, because the Santa in the picture was not part of the family, not part of any studio record, and not part of any tradition known to historians. And yet, he stood there, claiming a place he should never have occupied. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe, hit the notification bell, and comment where you're watching from. The archivist who discovered the photo, Dr. Lydia Markham, specialized in late 19th century American portraiture. She knew the conventions, formal attire, stiff poses, a visual language obsessed with order. Christmas portraits of that era rarely included Santa figures at all. He didn't become a common studio prop until the 20th century. But this man, he wasn't a prop. His suit was not the cheerful red wool that would later define the image. Instead, it was a heavy, almost ecclesiastical garment, dark velvet trimmed with fur too coarse for commercial costuming. His beard wasn't theatrical cotton but real, wiry hair streaked with something darker at the roots. The initial hypothesis was simple and polite. Perhaps he was a relative playing a seasonal role, perhaps a beloved uncle or grandfather. But the records told a different story. The family in the photograph, the Hartsells of Olmsted County, had no living male relative over 40 in 1894 except the father seated in the image. No performer, no actor, no kindly elder. And according to the Hartsell family Bible, the date the photograph was taken, December 22nd, was also the date their youngest child began refusing to enter the parlor, insisting for months afterward that the man in the beard watched her through the walls. Dr. Markham magnified the image until the grain fractured. That was when she noticed the real anomaly, the hands. The man in the Santa costume had placed his hands on the father's shoulders, but the grip wasn't gentle, his fingers pressed hard enough to wrinkle the wool suit beneath them. And beneath his fingernails, something dark appeared trapped. Soil? Ink? Blood? It was impossible to tell, but it wasn't the gesture of a benevolent holiday figure. It was a claim. Behind the children, faint but visible when the contrast was adjusted, stood the blurred silhouette of another structure, something like a barn or outbuilding. And on its doorframe, a shape appeared that predated Christmas iconography entirely, a chalk mark common among Scandinavian immigrants, drawn during winters of exceptionally harsh weather. The mark warned travelers that an evil spirit had been seen near the home, a Julvendreren, the winter walker. A figure believed to arrive during the solstice, wearing the furs of a hunter, moving from house to house, searching for families who had broken certain oaths. No one in America should have been using that mark in 1894. No one except the newly arrived Norwegians in rural Minnesota, and the Hartsells were English, not Scandinavian. The reconstruction grew darker. That winter, the newspapers recorded a blizzard that buried 3 counties. The Hartsell farmhands reported hearing footsteps on the roof each night, long after the family had gone to bed. And one entry in the father's ledger, buried among receipts and cattle counts, read only, "He came to the door again. I told him we owed nothing." Archives across 2 states revealed that 3 farms neighboring the Hartsells suffered unexplained fires between December and February. Survivors described a man in a winter pelt suit walking the property line hours before each blaze. Yet no sheriff ever questioned him. No court record ever named him. The core truth emerged not from newspapers but from a letter written by the eldest Hartsell daughter decades later, discovered among estate papers. "Mother forbade us to speak of the visitor. Father let him in that night." The photograph was payment. But he wanted more. And so the portrait survived, 8 figures assembled before a wooden backdrop, trying to appear like a family celebrating Christmas. But the man standing behind the father was neither Santa nor kin. He was something older, something the Hartsells feared enough to allow into their home, something they believed demanded a record of itself. When the photograph was taken, every face in the image tried to remain still. Every face except his. If you look closely, even now, you can see it, the faintest curl of a smile, as if he knew the camera would preserve him long after the heart cells were gone. And it did. The family line ended within a generation. The house collapsed in a storm. The land was sold and resold. But the man in the suit remains, trapped in a portrait that was never meant to be comforting, waiting in the frame, his hands still gripping the shoulders of a father who could no longer deny him. The past doesn't always stay frozen in photographs. Sometimes it keeps breathing. Dr. Markham had examined thousands of Victorian portraits, but none had followed her home the way this one did. Even after leaving the archive, the faces clung to her thoughts, the children rigid as carved ivory, the father trying to appear calm while a stranger's hands dug into his shoulders. The more she searched, the more the heart cell portrait felt like an intrusion not just into a family's past, but into whatever had once stalked their winters. She reopened the photograph the next morning under controlled light. Adjusting the exposure revealed details buried in the darker regions of the background, the blurred outbuilding, the chalk mark, the faint trail in the snow behind the studio backdrop. Trails didn't appear in posed indoor portraits. Unless the photographer had dragged something in from outside, or unless the backdrop wasn't fully sealed, allowing the real world to bleed through. The Hartzell family history offered few answers. Census records listed them as prosperous farmers, church-going, English stock, no scandals. Yet their parish ledger contained two curious entries. In December 1893 the family donated 3 sheep for winter blessing rites, and the following year the donation shifted to 1 steer, unbutchered. These were not Christian offerings. They matched rituals described in 18th-century Norwegian folktales, sacrifices left at the edge of property lines to appease the Jolvendreren, the winter walker who demanded a household acknowledge a debt older than Christianity itself. Dr. Markham pressed deeper into regional histories. Minnesota's settlement records from the 1880s showed dozens of Norwegian families living north of the Hartzell farm, their letters filled with warnings about unwelcome figures crossing the threshold when the nights grew longest. They sketched him always the same, fur coat, heavy boots, posture too upright for a man carrying such weight. A being who knocked only once. A being who never entered uninvited, unless a family owed him something from the previous winter. Slowly, a pattern formed around the Hartzells. A neighbor's diary mentioned seeing an unfamiliar man walking near the Hartzell barn 2 nights before Christmas. A schoolteacher recalled that the Hartzell children arrived late to class that winter, exhausted and pale. And a final clue surfaced in the probate file, a sealed envelope addressed to the eldest son, opened only after his death in 1928. Inside lay a single strip of blackened wool, fur, perhaps, and a line written in a shaking hand, "He is not to be welcomed again." Dr. Markham's reconstruction shifted from hypothesis to dread. The studio photographer had not recorded the man in any appointment log. Yet the glass plate declared his presence irrefutably. The man had entered the studio without objection, positioned himself behind the father, and placed his hands with a familiarity that alarmed the children into stillness. This was not a festive choice. This was an obligation. A settlement. The portrait wasn't a holiday keepsake. It was proof, evidence that the Hartzells had complied with something they feared. Something that required a witness. But what sealed the conclusion wasn't the family's expression. It was the fact that the Santa figure cast no shadow. Every child cast a clear one on the studio floor. The father's shadow leaned right. Even the props had shadows consistent with the electric lamps of 1890s rural photography. Only he stood without one. Dr. Markham magnified his boots and saw snow clinging to the fur trim, real snow, melting even as the exposure captured him. She checked the studio ledger. The photograph was taken indoors, in a heated room. No one should have carried snow onto the set without leaving water stains, yet the flooring remained dry. The truth formed slowly, terrible in its clarity. The man behind the father had not entered through the door. He had entered through obligation, something old, inherited, never paid in full. And the photograph was the Hartzells' final attempt to appease whatever watched them each winter. Weeks later, when Dr. Markham attempted to reskin the plate, she found something new, a faint distortion behind the Santa figure, like breath on glass. as if someone had leaned too close to the camera, as if he had been nearer than anyone realized. The Hartzell family vanished from Minnesota records by 1902. No forwarding address. No burial sites. Not a single descendant traced. Only this portrait remained, 8 faces and one presence who did not belong among them, yet stood exactly where he intended to stand. And in the archivist's mind, one question grew heavier than the rest. If he appeared behind them uninvited, who had he stood behind before? Dr. Markham didn't sleep the night the distortion appeared on the glass plate. She reviewed every explanation, humidity, scanning error, residue on the scanner bed, but none accounted for the shape she saw. It wasn't random fogging. It curved, tapering like the outline of a cheek leaning too close to the lens. Victorian cameras required long exposures. No photographer would risk a subject moving that much, unless the subject wasn't bound by the ordinary rules of movement at all. She brought the photograph back to the conservation lab the next morning. With gloved hands, she examined the plate under magnification. There, beneath the grain, she found a detail she had somehow missed, a faint mark etched into the emulsion near the lower left corner. At first it appeared accidental, perhaps from mishandling. But under angled light the shape clarified into deliberate lines, 3 vertical strokes crossed by a single horizontal bar. She recognized it instantly. It was identical to the chalk symbol on the outbuilding behind the family. Only here, the mark was scratched directly into the glass, as if someone, or something, wanted to ensure it would be carried forward no matter how many copies of the photograph existed. She checked the studio's surviving plates from the same winter. None bore marks. None showed outside structures bleeding through a backdrop. None contained unidentified figures. It was as though the Hartzell portrait didn't follow the photographic rules of its time. It followed the rules of whatever ritual the family had inherited. Cross-referencing diaries from Norwegian settlers, Dr. Markham found a reference to a being known as Den Som Starbak, the one who stands behind. In these folktales, he appeared only in midwinter, lurking near families who had failed to honor a pact made generations earlier. The stories agreed on one point: he did not speak. He only watched from just behind the head of the household. If the debt remained unpaid by the solstice, he moved forward. The Hartzell portrait placed him exactly where the legend said he would stand. As she reconstructed the family's timeline, another clue surfaced, one so subtle that archivists had dismissed it for years. In the county's winter census of 1895, an inspector recorded that the Hartzell farmhouse had 3 upstairs bedrooms prepared for children, but only 2 in use. The eldest girl, Abigail, age 13, had disappeared from school rosters the same year. Her disappearance was never investigated. The family claimed she was staying with relatives in Wisconsin. No such relatives existed. Dr. Markham re-examined the photograph. 7 children were listed in the Hartzell household that winter, but only 6 appeared in the portrait. 1 empty space existed on the right side of the frame, a gap where the children did not cluster, as though something occupied it the photographer couldn't see, but the children could. 3 of the children angled away slightly from that empty space. Only the smallest boy faced it directly, eyes widened in a terror he tried to hide by biting his lip. The center figure, by contrast, seemed to angle toward that empty space as well, as if addressing someone missing from the frame, or someone removed. Digging deeper, Dr. Markham uncovered an older record, a farm deed transferring ownership of the Hartzell property from a Norwegian immigrant family named the Larsens in 1878. Along with the deed was a final line of scrawled instruction: keep the midwinter promise. If you invite him once, you must invite him always. The Hartzells had not been the first family to face this figure. And the Larsens? Their entire household vanished in January 1879. The property was listed abandoned until the Hartzells purchased it that spring. Local rumor blamed wolves and blizzard collapse. But one detail stood out: the parlor window of the Larsen home had been shattered from the inside. A pattern formed: families inheriting land that carried an older obligation, families failing to understand the terms, families paying in children first. Finally, Dr. Markham found the photographer's personal journal, one of the few remaining from that region and era. The entry for December 22nd, 1894 was only a sentence. A winter guest stood behind Mr. Hartzell today. His breath fogged the lens though the room was warm. That detail froze her blood. Fogging meant breath. Breath meant presence. Presence meant the figure in the portrait was not a spirit metaphor, not a superstition, but something that exhaled, observed, and understood the act of being photographed. The last line of the photographer's entry struck her hardest. The children would not look behind their father. None of them turned. Not even when he whispered. Whatever had stood behind the father that day had leaned close enough to whisper into the photographer's ear, or into the father's. And the photograph had captured the moment just before the debt came due. By January, Dr. Markham had gathered enough fragments, census gaps, diary scraps, studio logs, to attempt what historians fear most, reconstructing a night no one survived to describe. The Hartzell Christmas of 1894 did not end with the portrait. It was only the opening movement of a ritual already in motion. Winter that year was recorded as unnaturally heavy. Snow drifts rose past window frames, livestock froze standing upright. The Hartzell children missed school for nearly a month. A neighbor's recollection captured the turning point. Their chimney smoked wrong. Like someone burning green wood or wet fur. Fur was the recurring detail, something animal, damp, brought inside when it shouldn't have been. Dr. Markham envisioned the night of December 22nd, hours after the portrait was taken. The family returned home before dusk, faces still pale from the stranger's presence. The father likely tried to reassure them with the language of men who don't believe in old stories. It's just a costume. Just a man. But the children knew better. Their fear was not of Santa, but of a figure who never belonged in their country to begin with. At supper, the youngest refused to sit in the chair at the end of the table. She said someone stood behind her. No family member was tall enough to cast the shadow she insisted she saw, long, vertical, shifting as though swaying in thick winter wind. The mother, Mary Hartzell, kept diaries for 20 years. Her final entry ended mid-sentence. He asked if we had kept the what? The promise? The offering? The child they owed? For in Norwegian folklore, the Jolvendreren did not seek livestock or food. He demanded a living winter pledge, a child promised to him if the family ever called upon his aid. The Larsons, the farm's previous owners, had used the symbol during a famine winter. They survived. Their eldest daughter did not. The Hartzells had inherited the land. And with it, the debt. The tragedy likely unfolded in 3 stages, each preserved only in fragments of memory from those who weren't present but heard too much. Stage 1, the footsteps. On December 23rd, 3 neighbors reported footsteps circling their own homes, heavy, dragging, rhythmic, as if someone walked in deep snow. But no prints were found. And each stated the same chilling detail: the footsteps stopped whenever anyone approached a window. Stage 2, the knock. Norwegian settlers wrote that the winter walker knocked only once, never twice. The Hartzell farmhouse doorframe, preserved in a museum storage unit, showed a splintering strike mark too high for any man in the region. 7 feet off the ground. Not an axe. Not a fist. Something heavier. Stage 3, the taking. The final stage was preserved only through a single testimony. In 1910, the Hartzells' nearest neighbor, then an elderly woman, told a visiting pastor she had heard a child scream like she was being lifted. Lifted, not dragged. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, resonant hum, like a man singing, but colder. She never registered it formally, fearing ridicule. But she repeated the detail twice: cold singing. On December 24th, the Hartzell home was found unlocked, lamplight still burning. Plates remained on the table, food half-eaten. Chairs overturned. Snow tracked across the parlor floor in long, deliberate streaks that did not melt. The children were gone. The parents were gone. Only one thing remained at the center of the room: a strip of coarse white fur, glistening with frost. Investigators at the time never questioned human foul play. They blamed wolves, blizzards, exposure. God's will. But wolves do not open doors without breaking them. Wolves do not walk upright. Wolves do not leave symbols scratched into glass plates before the tragedy begins. Dr. Markham stood over these gathered pieces, maps, transcripts, photographs, feeling less like a historian and more like someone intruding upon a story that had never wanted to be retold. The tragedy was not random. It was inherited. A ritual repeated every generation until the land found a family who no longer understood the terms. And the portrait? It captured the moment before the taking, when the winter walker placed his hands on the father's shoulders, choosing him first. The Hartzells hadn't posed with Santa. They had posed with their executioner. And he had smiled. Dr. Markham had reconstructed the immediate tragedy, but the portrait gnawed at her more deeply than any timeline could explain. The stranger in the fur-trimmed coat was not a ghostly blur, not a mythic embellishment. He was present, corporeal, and documented. That meant there had to be more, other records, other testimonies, other families who had encountered the same winter visitor and left behind traces the archives had not understood for over a century. She began with the symbol scratched into the plate. The intersecting strokes appeared in only one known place in Minnesota's regional folklore, a set of privately circulated pamphlets printed in the late 1870s by Reverend Anders Kahl, a Norwegian pastor who warned settlers about the ancient covenant that follows the land, not the blood. Local historians had always dismissed Kahl as overly superstitious, a man who brought old-world fears into the hard pragmatism of frontier life. But his surviving papers, nearly 600 pages, contained a chilling consistency. For times, he referenced households where a Christmas guest appeared uninvited, standing behind the patriarch as if claiming him. 3 of those families vanished under mysterious circumstances. The 4th family fled southward before midwinter, leaving their farm in such haste they abandoned livestock, tools, and every personal possession. A witness claimed their barn door remained open for days, as though something large had pushed it outward. The more Dr. Markham read, the more she understood that the Hartzells were not an isolated case. They were the last link in a chain stretching back decades, possibly centuries. One pamphlet described a photograph remarkably similar to the Hartzell portrait, a family gathered for a winter portrait in 1882, with an overshadowing figure whose face could not be recalled by any present afterward. That photograph was now missing from public collections, lost, destroyed, or quietly removed. The only surviving reference was a line in a museum accession log, image withdrawn at donor's request, subject includes inadmissible figure. A figure. Singular. Unnamed. Next, Dr. Markham traveled to Olmsted County to examine property records. The Hartzell farm had inexplicably changed ownership 6 times between 1861 and 1880, each transfer occurring in late winter. Several families had moved after only one season. A pattern emerged: farms with the chalk-marked outbuilding were abandoned most quickly. When she visited the site, now nothing more than a stone foundation and wind-flattened grass, she found remnants the Historical Society had overlooked. On a buried beam beneath layers of collapsed flooring lay the same mark etched into the Hartzell plate. Deep gouges. Fresh enough, impossibly, that the wood fibers curled upward as though cut only years ago rather than more than a century. And beneath that beam, as if placed intentionally, she discovered a scrap of wool matted with frozen soil, coarse white fur like the strip left in the Hartzell parlor. Only here the fur was tangled with something else, a thin, brittle strand of hair that did not match animal origin. Under microscope, the strand revealed the flattened cross-section characteristic of human hair. But the color, translucent white, not gray, suggested something different. Something unigid. She needed more context, more living memory. In a nursing home an hour north, she found the last surviving descendant of the Larson family, the ones who had owned the land before the Hartzells. 93-year-old Ingrid Larson's voice shook, but her memories did not. She remembered stories whispered by her grandmother about the winter-taker who came when the farm's boundary markers faded. A being who marked families as surely as families marked their land. Dr. Markham asked the question no historian dared voice aloud: did anyone ever see him clearly? Ingrid nodded slowly. Only the fathers. He shows himself to the one who speaks for the house. The others, they see only what they can bear. And the children? Dr. Markham asked. Here, Ingrid's eyes filled with something older than sorrow. The children hear him before they see him. They hear the humming. Humming. The same sound the neighbor had described in 1894, a cold singing, low and resonant. When Dr. Markham asked why no one ever intervened, Ingrid delivered the line that rewrote the entire investigation. My grandmother said he wasn't a curse. He was a collector. Someone long before us asked for his help in winter. And when he returned to claim the price, they refused. The debt passed to every family who lived on that land. No one escaped it. A collector. Not a myth. Not a monster. An enforcer of a pact forgotten by those who inherited it. The further Dr. Markham expanded her search, the more she found references to vanished families, abandoned farms, and winter nights described in language too careful to be coincidence. Each account contained the same details: snow brought indoors without melting, footprints that appeared where no door had opened, and children describing a man standing behind father even when no one else saw him. Piece by piece, the investigation widened into something undeniable. The Hartzell portrait was not the first record of this visitor. It was simply the clearest one, because he wanted to be seen. And in the photo, he had chosen where to stand. Always behind the father. Always close enough to touch. The more Dr. Markham expanded the archive trail, the more she realized the winter walker wasn't tied to the Hartzells themselves but to a transaction far older, something sealed long before any of them were born. The pattern of vanished families didn't radiate outward from one bloodline. It radiated from one patch of land. She returned to the county land records, this time tracing deeds not back to the Larsons but further, to the original settler who claimed the farm in 1858, Matthias Rind, a Norwegian immigrant who arrived alone and constructed the first cabin on the property. His journals, preserved only in shards, contained a phrase repeated dozens of times: he waited with patience. I called him in the deep cold. Why would someone call such a presence intentionally? Dr. Markham found her answer in a fragment from December 1861. That winter had been catastrophic. Temperatures dropped to record lows, settlers died in their beds, livestock froze mid-step, entire communities abandoned their claims and fled east. Matthias wrote that he had lost 3 children in a single week and his wife hovered close to death. In one entry, he described lighting a lantern at the property line and marking the symbol, the same one found on the Hartzell plate, in ash and tallow. I begged for mercy, he wrote in Norwegian. I begged for one life spared. I saw him at the edge of the trees. He stood behind me, his breath cold on my neck. He said nothing, but I felt the terms. The terms. That was the beginning. 3 weeks later, Matthias's wife recovered unexpectedly. His surviving children regained strength. His livestock, thought dead, rose when thaw came. Neighbors called it a miracle. Matthias did not. In the final entry before he vanished in early spring, he wrote, I have borrowed winter from a collector. I will pay next solstice. But Matthias didn't pay. He fled instead. The land changed hands repeatedly afterward, each new family unaware they inherited a debt that never expired. Dr. Markham stared at the timeline, realizing the unspoken truth: the winter walker did not hunt at random. He simply returned for a life promised long ago. And when the one who promised failed to deliver, the obligation transferred to the land. So he came each winter looking for the family patriarch, the one who spoke for the household. And the children, they were simply the collateral. But the photograph still held one unanswered detail: why would the winter walker allow himself to be captured on camera? Folklore insisted he was elusive, unrecordable, shifting like a shadow. Yet here he stood with almost ceremonial stillness. The answer came from an unexpected source, an 1896 letter from a photographer in Wisconsin describing a phenomenon he called the guest who permits the plate. In it, he claimed that certain figures tethered to old covenants could appear in photographs when a household attempted to renegotiate terms. A photograph, in those communities, wasn't a keepsake. It was evidence, proof a family had acknowledged the visitor's authority. When the Hartzells sat for their portrait, they weren't commemorating Christmas. They were documenting compliance. But something had gone wrong. The missing daughter, Abigail. The empty space in the portrait. The child removed before the shutter clicked. What if the Hartzells had tried to offer her as payment? What if they believed they could choose which life was taken? Dr. Markham located one more archival scrap, an unsigned note tucked inside the local pastor's 1895 ledger. They offered the wrong child. He would not accept her. He wanted the voice that called out to him. The voice. It had to be the youngest child, the one who said she saw him in the parlor. Folklore stated that children who saw the Winter Walker became bound to him. To offer another child in her place would have been a violation of the pact. The Hartzells tried to cheat the collector. And he responded not by taking one child, but all of them. Dr. Markham sat back, lungs tight, as the pieces clicked into place. The truth was horrifying not because it defied logic, but because it followed a grim, consistent logic of its own. Matthias Rind had made a desperate bargain. The debt passed to every family who lived on the land. The Hartzells, like those before them, tried to break the terms. And the Winter Walker claimed what had been promised. Still, one question remained, a question as dark as it was simple. Why had the Winter Walker posed with his hands gripping the father's shoulders? The pastor's ledger provided the final, devastating answer. He stands behind the one who chooses. For it is the father who calls him, whether he knows it or not. The Hartzell father had reenacted Matthias Rind's call without understanding it. By stepping into the studio with the Winter Walker behind him, he had accepted the pact anew. And the children paid the price. In the days after uncovering the final ledger, Dr. Markham felt the investigation tightening around her like a noose woven of paper, ink, and breath that didn't belong to any century. The Winter Walker was no longer a folkloric echo or a regional superstition. He was documented, traced, photographically verified. And yet every official record, every sheriff's note, coroner's file, church testimony had been quietly softened, redacted, or misfiled until the Hartzell tragedy dissolved into harmless rumor. Entire families erased as though winter itself had swallowed them. It should have ended there. The truth was known, even if no institution would ever acknowledge it. The land had inherited a debt that generations kept failing to pay. But truth, once named, rarely stays still. And the Hartzell photograph still lingered on Dr. Markham's desk, its glass plate reflecting a figure who stood behind the father with a familiarity bordering on possession. One evening, after the archives closed, she illuminated the photograph for one final examination. She wasn't sure why, compulsion, closure, or the uneasy sense that she had overlooked one last thread. As she zoomed into the lower margin, the scratches marking the Winter Walker's claimed presence shimmered under the light. The shadows deepened. The distortions, those breath-like smudges, seemed sharper than before. She checked the scan against earlier versions. The smudge had grown. Only by a millimeter, but undeniably. A shape that once resembled mere fog now bore the faint curve of a jawline. Photographic plates do not change once developed. Unless the subject they captured continues to exist within the frame. Anxious, she compared the image to the photographer's journal again, reading the final lines in their original Norwegian. He allows himself to be photographed only when a debt has not been met. The plate becomes an open door. If kept, he returns. An open door. Archivists are trained not to believe in hauntings. But doors, real or metaphorical, are mechanisms of access. If the plate was an opening rather than a record, then keeping it in a climate-controlled drawer might not have been preservation. It might have been invitation. That night, Dr. Markham awoke to a noise in her apartment, soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Footsteps. Not within the room, but above it, moving slowly across the ceiling with the weight of something accustomed to deep snow. She held her breath until the steps paused directly over her bed, then resumed toward the hallway. In the morning, she told herself it was old pipes, settling beams, her own mind molding folklore into fear. But at the archives, when she unlocked the storage drawer, the Hartzell plate was cold. Not room temperature, cold enough to fog the air when she touched it, cold enough that frost traced the edges of the glass like a filigree. And the smudge, the one she feared, had grown again. The archivist attempted a controlled experiment, placing the glass plate under a sealed humidity dome. When she returned an hour later, the condensation inside had gathered into a shape, 5 elongated fingerprints pressed from the inside of the dome outward. The exact configuration of the grip the Winter Walker had placed on the father's shoulders. That was when she realized the final truth, horrifying in its simplicity. The Winter Walker did not haunt the land. He haunted the record of the land. And now she had become its recorder. There would be no institutional acknowledgement, no published paper, no academic award. Only her notes, sealed, and the photograph, now slated for restricted access due to environmental instability. A bureaucratic phrase that concealed the truth. The image was no longer inert. On her last day working with the collection, she performed the archivist's ritual of returning items to storage. But when she approached the drawer containing the heart cell plate, she stopped short. A thin line of frost seeped outward from the metal seam. And from inside, faintly, so faint she might have imagined it, came a low hum. A cold humming, resonant and steady, like the breath of someone standing just behind her. Dr. Markham backed away slowly. She left the drawer unopened. She left the room dark. She left the building without signing out. The heart cell photograph remains in the archive to this day, undisplayed, unscanned, untouched except by those who do not read the warnings attached to its file. Staff have reported sudden drafts in the climate vault during midwinter, though no vents run through that section. One intern quit after claiming she heard footsteps in the aisle behind her, even though she was working alone. And the plate? It has developed a new imperfection on its surface. Not a smudge. Not fogging. A shape. A silhouette at the back of the frame. Tall. Fur-trimmed. Leaning forward. As if something inside the photograph is steadying the viewer in return. The heart cells learned too late that debts made in winter are never forgiven. Dr. Markham may yet learn the same lesson. And in the dark, cold drawer where the plate now sleeps, the walker stands behind another figure, waiting for the moment the door opens again.